Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm really glad to have you guys back here. As per usual, I am your host, Coach Susan. Now, a month or two ago, if not more, I did a video on how to invest in treasury bills and bonds. That video is so detailed with demonstrations, calculations and all. So if you've ever wondered exactly what treasury bills and bonds are, how to invest in them here in Kenya, and you for some reason missed that video and didn't watch it, people really loved it, I'm going to link it down in the description box below. Now, since I posted that video, I've gotten quite a number of people on the comment section and even in my emails wanting me to address the risks associated with investing in treasury bills and bonds. It's what most people would consider a very lucrative investment, and it's attractive. But obviously, there's really nothing under the sun that does not have risk attached to it, some form of risk. So on today's episode, I want to talk about the biggest risk that I've picked up from the comments that people are very worried about, because this is an investment with the government of Kenya. Most people want to know what would happen in the case that the government, because of either financial issues, I know in Kenya right now, for a while, especially this year, we've had a lot of worries around our financial situation as a country. And guys are worried, like, what if the government is unable to pay me? Would I lose my money? And that risk is ideally referred to as the default risk. So today's episode is about addressing the default risk, what it looks like and how it would manifest. And then I'm just going to talk to you guys about what would ideally transpire or happen if it ever got to that point. So if you're interested to learn more about the default risk, keep watching. So very quickly, let's just define what a default risk is. Now, in the case of government bills and bonds, a default risk is a situation where the issuer of a bond, in this case, as we've said, would be the government of Kenya, would fail to meet its debt obligations, including interest payments or even principal repayment. Now, ideally, how bonds work, for example, you lock your money with the government for a long period of time. Most bonds range anything between 2 to 30 years. So you could get a 7-year bond, 11-year bond, 25-year bond. And I see a lot of people worrying and panicking over that because they're like, this is too long a duration to trust the government. What happens when regimes change or there are issues to do with political, just challenges and issues or economic issues, what would happen? So a default risk pretty much just means that for one of those reasons, the government is completely unable to meet its obligations. Now, that would either mean that they are not able to pay you your semi-annual coupons as agreed or as planned, or they're not able to pay you the initial principal investment that you put in the investment once the maturity period has arrived. Now, African countries that have defaulted, I want to start there because the first thing that I'd like you to note is how infrequent it is for an actual government to default on government bills, on its government bills and bonds. So I just collected some data and I'd like to read it out for you guys. So some of the confirmed defaults that we've seen in Africa: in Zambia in 2020, they defaulted on a Eurobond repayment, and this triggered a debt restructuring process. And then we had Ghana in 2023, who announced suspension of external debt servicing, which included Eurobonds, which also meant that they actually entered into a default or rather a debt restructuring program. I think as Kenyans, we really followed up on the whole Ghana issue. It's the most recent one. And it had us very worried when 2024 started because our government was giving signs of we may not be able to repay back our Eurobond, which would have ideally led to a default, but it did not, okay? Now, some countries like, for example, Mozambique and Ethiopia had what we call a potential or a selective default. So what happened in Mozambique, for example, and this happened in 2017, there was a delayed payment on domestic commercial debt, and they considered a selective default by some credit rating agencies. And then we also, so literally they just delayed. It's not that they did not pay, but the payment delayed. And then in 2023, Ethiopia actually missed a coupon payment on an international bond, and they also entered into some bit of debt restructuring discussions. Now, why am I reading you these examples? Zambia, Ghana, Mozambique, Ethiopia. Out of all the countries we have in Africa, these are some of the documented defaults that we have experienced. And what I actually would like you to pick from it is that a full-blown default by the government, like on Treasury bills and bonds, and by full-blown, I mean they are completely unable to like pay you your coupons. They're unable to pay you back your principal investment amount. And like there's literally no discussion or restructuring around when and how you will recover your money. Like that kind of a full-blown default is absolutely rare, right? Unheard of, and it is a really, really, really like worst case scenario. Yeah, it's in fact we consider it a very, very low possibility, right? And even if it ever plays out, the most likely scenario would be issues to do with debt restructuring. Okay, so I've just taken time to explain and to give examples on, you know, what a default would look like, how other countries have actually handled it. Please ensure you do more reading on this channel. We are smart people. We read, we research, okay? But that's ideally what a default would look like. So what I want us to just get into, which is the meat of today's video, I want to really discuss for someone who's already invested in Treasury bills and bonds, or for someone who's considering investing in bills and bonds, and you're really worried about a default risk happening in any way, whether it's going to lead to restructuring or delay. I would like to just run you through very, very quickly the possible scenarios of what would transpire or what would happen if you're an investor in Treasury bills and bonds, and our government, for example, the government of Kenya, experiences financial issues or liquidity issues to a point that they would default on government bills and bonds. So let's get straight into that. So these are the potential steps that would occur in a default scenario. So assuming that because of liquidity and cash flow issues, the government is not able to meet its obligations how they promised. Now, let me remind you what the promise usually is, especially with like government bonds. With government bonds is that the government keeps your money. Let's say if you buy a 7-year bond, they keep that money for 7 years until maturity. Maturity is when the 7-year period lapses, and then they pay you back your money. But throughout the 7 years, you've been getting semi-annual interest payments, which are referred to as coupons, okay? That is in the case of bonds. The promise when it comes to bills is that if you bought a 91-day Treasury bill, then after 91 days, you should be able to recover both your money and the interest that you earned. If it's 182 or 364-day bill, the same is also applied, okay? So the first thing that would happen in the case of a default scenario would be a missed payment. And a missed payment ideally means that every 6 months, I'm supposed to receive a coupon because I invested this X amount of money in a bond. And the first thing that would ideally happen would be that the government failed to meet a scheduled debt repayment or coupon repayment on a bond, for example. So that would ideally be like the first indication, right? Or the first scenario to occur that would alert me as an investor that there is a problem, okay? So most of the times you'll just notice, I mean, even with liquidity issues, coupons are usually very regular. As a matter of fact, for any of you guys who's invested, you know they come at a fixed date. They never delay. They never come a day later or even a day sooner. When you're actually reading your bond document, maybe I can put up an image here for you guys to see. You can even see the interest repayment dates. They are indicated when you should expect your interest. So this is the first thing that would happen, a missed payment. Like, for example, what happened in Ethiopia in 2023, where they missed a coupon payment. So at that particular point, that would be what I would call like an onset or a red flag that there is a possible default risk, okay? So it's not just about people rumor mongering and giving you fear that, you know, the government might default. If it has never gotten to a point where like we've literally experienced like a missed payment or a missed coupon, I would not necessarily like lose sleep at night worrying whether like I will lose money in bonds, okay? The second thing that would potentially happen would be like a grace period, okay? A grace period means that there might be a period before the official default, is actually announced or declares, yeah? And this ideally allows for negotiations with creditors. Now, again, why would the government be unable to pay? It's because they don't have money or they, so what would ideally happen is that, because you see, for a default to actually be official, it has to be announced, it has to be declared that for this particular year, we will not be paying coupons, or for this particular year, we will not be paying maturities. So before it is actually announced, what would usually happen is that there's a grace period that has been given, and this gives the government some time to have a negotiation with its creditors, whether that is us, domestic investors, because remember, we are not the only people who invest with the government of Kenya or who give them money. There is also international investors that put money in our country through government bills and bonds, and even like stuff like the Eurobond. And then we also have domestic investors. So you would see that, for example, if the obligations are too many, and maybe they owe us, domestic investors, but they also owe other international investors or creditors, they would ideally get into a negotiation period where maybe they negotiate with one of the parties and maybe extend when, can we pay you next year, or can you give us, they would ideally negotiate so that instead of being so stretched out, they first of all maybe get like a grace period from creditor ABC, so that, for example, they're able to pay domestic investors or something of the sort. So there would be a grace period. And I genuinely feel like that happened this year, because early this year around like March, April, the conversation around bills and bonds, even online, was very, 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 it was hot, because we had very prominent even politicians go online and say, this government will actually default on bonds this year. And we were so worried. We had a Eurobond that was due to be paid in June, and guys were also worried about that. I feel like some form of negotiations happened, and that's maybe one of the reasons why we did not experience or see a default this year. Okay. Now, the third thing, after the grace period, the third thing that would ideally happen is now negotiations with us as the domestic investors. Okay. So if we hold Kenyan government bills and bonds, and truly it has gotten to a point where even after trying to get a grace period, there's just very little that can be done, and still there's a possibility that there's gonna be some form of default. This is how it would occur. You would probably see within the negotiations, the government would negotiate with us as the investors for a restructure. Okay, so restructuring can happen ideally. The most common way a restructure would happen is for them to negotiate or to restructure our maturity dates, for example. Okay, so note that down, maturity date. That's how a negotiation would ideally happen. So in other words, my bond was a 7-year bond. The 7 years are ending in 2024, but the government is saying they cannot give me back my principal amount or my principal investment for, in this year. It was supposed to be paid this year, but they're unable. So they would restructure or renegotiate an extension in maturity, which would ideally mean that they're going to maybe pay me back in another year or in 2 years. And this is one of the reasons, guys, I always encourage, this is not a reason to fear bonds. It's a reason for you to diversify. I don't know if that makes sense. Before you put your money in such a long-term investment like a bond, I would highly, highly recommend that you have other investments that are liquid in a way. Because you see, the only thing that would happen in that case is that you would ideally be inconvenienced. Maybe you planned that's the year that your maturity will come, and you'll use that money to buy land, or you'll use that money to build, or you'll use that money to take your child to school. And, the government has told you 2024 is not the year. We're not paying you back this money. We'll pay you in 2 years, or we'll pay you in 3 years. So you will experience an inconvenience. So if you do not have other avenues of money that can sustain you in the meantime, you'd really get frustrated. So learn to diversify. I've always told people, I know bonds are good. I know stock markets are good. I know all these high income generating investments are really good, but it's so important to diversify your investments in such a way that you have some form of liquidity. Does that make sense, guys? You must have some form of liquidity. You must have investments that, and even an emergency fund, like a buffer, right? Because sometimes the emergency is not losing your job or being unwell. Sometimes the emergency is that money you expected from an investment like a bond delays because of the case of a default, okay? The second thing would also be reducing of interest rates. They would negotiate. So maybe when you entered into the bill or the bond agreement, the interest rate was 19% per annum. And then because of cash flow and liquidity issues in the country and, to avoid a fully blown out default, they would also negotiate to kind of like, reduce the interest rate. So you're looking at the first thing we've said you need to note down is the maturity date negotiation. The second thing that would happen is interest rate negotiation. And then the third thing that would happen is a partial repayment. So they would probably say maybe we owe you 7 million, but can we pay you half first? So then pay you like 50%, like it would be like amortized or spread out, them paying you back your principal amount. So you maybe get half, and then after a stipulated duration of months or maybe a year or so, then you get the other amount. So those three things are ideally how the government negotiating with its investors would do it. Okay, so what have we said? Just let's catch up. We've said maturity date is one of the areas they can negotiate on. Interest rates is another area the government would negotiate on. And then number 3, partial repayments. Now, a fourth effect or the fourth thing that would happen in the case of a default would ideally be the credit rating of Kenya in general or whichever country you come from would pretty much be downgraded, right? Now, credit rating agencies exist for a reason, and they rate countries depending on how able or how well they are able to meet their debt obligations, how soon they pay, and even if they have the capability to do that. Now, what happens if a credit rating of a country goes down? It ideally means that the country is not it makes it expensive for them to be able to actually borrow money in the future externally. Unfortunately for African countries, and I don't even want to get into the entire discussion of why we are so heavily reliant on, let's say, external debt, that's a problem, right? So it's a problem because now that would mean that even in cases where like investor money is coming in or they've borrowed money, either whether that is for development purposes or for whatever purpose the government borrows, it would actually lower our ability. In fact, it will either lower investments into the country or make it so expensive, like the interest rates that the government would ideally get when they go to global markets to try and get investors or try to get some funding, that would ideally be a problem. And what we would ideally see from there is just overall economic impact. So we'd see things like investor confidence dropping. We'd see way less investments coming into the country, which would affect our economy. We'd also see increased interest rates, okay? Very, very high interest rates, and we'd also see things like the government reducing, reduced government spending. So then, that's ideally what our government should have ideally done, but that's a story for another day. I know Kenyans understand what I mean. So you would really struggle as an economy. Now, one of the things I want to just maybe say in conclusion, now that we know what a default risk would look like and how it would transpire, how severe the impact would really depend on the size and the nature of the default. Okay, guys? So as I've told you, the countries I read on earlier when this video started, some of them just missed one payment, others just restructured one Eurobond. So depending on how severe the default size is, then the effect, maybe you wouldn't even, I know sometimes there's dooms, and especially when people are really, really afraid, they really tend to go to the worst case scenario. But as you guys can see, before it really gets there, then a country has to come to a point. I believe that for a country to have a full-blown default on their government bills and bonds, it would really be that the country is really on its knees. The political space is completely crumbled. The economy of that country is non-existent. It has to be a really worst-case scenario. And in that particular point, then as citizens of that particular country, we'd be facing bigger problems than just the government defaulting on the bills and bonds, yeah? So what ideally I'm saying in conclusion is that while a default risk is something that could happen in the case of bills and bonds, it is highly unlikely. What would happen is possible restructuring. And as I've told you guys, that's how, negotiations and restructuring would ideally just ensure you will still get back your money. Maybe not when you had planned to, maybe not how you hoped you would, maybe not the interest rate that you initially signed up for, but like a full-blown default, like I lost 7 million in bonds and I've never been able to get back my 7 million back. That's highly, highly unlikely. Yeah. So that's ideally what maybe you need to know about the default risk. And I really, really hope that you've learned quite a bit about how the government would ideally handle a default scenario. I also hope I have helped some of you who are very, very afraid to invest in government bills and bonds because you're just like, I can't trust the Kenyan government. While you're sleeping on your money, I genuinely feel like there are people who are really taking advantage of the good rates that we have for government bills and bonds. So I would say just educate yourself on what some of these things would how they would transpire, like how I've explained in today's video, how a default risk would transpire. In conclusion, do I still think that it's a viable investment, even in Kenya today, as a Kenyan living in Kenya and knowing where our economy is at and how things are happening? I'm personally still investing in government bills and bonds. I recommend my clients to invest in bills and bonds. And if you have the money and you want passive income, I would recommend that you actually do invest in bills and bonds because, as I've told you guys, a complete utter default where you'd never recover your money is highly, highly unlikely. What I would recommend is that as you're investing in bills and bonds, please make sure that you have other low-risk, accessible and liquid investments. In other words, don't put money that you really are counting on in terms of like, when this money matures, I'm going to pay school fees or whatever. Have a diversification of some sort, okay? Now, I'm going to wrap it up there, but next week, I want to talk about more risks that I feel that people don't talk about and they do not know exist when it comes to investing in bills and bonds. I know the default risk is what is the most scary, but if you tune in next week, I'm gonna guide you through some 3 or 4 other risks that you should know and be aware about if you'd like to become or remain an investor in government bills and bonds. So please share this video, like it, and also please turn on the notification bell and subscribe so that you can be notified when I upload next week's video as part 2 or a continuation of today's discussion. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode of Finance Friday.